Did you know that behind the victories and achievements of King David, there lies a hidden truth that few people know? Today we're going to reveal what made him a man after God's own heart, even with all his flaws and internal battles. If you've ever felt burdened by your own mistakes or sought to understand how someone so imperfect can find grace, this story will speak directly to your heart. Stay until the end, because you might discover something that transforms your perspective on life. And if this story has already piqued your curiosity, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any detail of this powerful revelation. Imagine a moment of great uncertainty and expectation, where the future of an entire nation hung in the balance. The people of Israel longed for a strong leader, someone who could guide and protect them. However, King Saul, the first chosen by God, had strayed from the path. He disobeyed, lost divine favor, and so a new chapter needed to be written. Saul was still on the throne, but God had decided it was time to seek a new leader. He chose the prophet Samuel for this mission. Samuel was a man of faith, respected and feared throughout Israel. When God spoke to him, "I have rejected Saul as king. Go to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, for I have chosen one of his sons to be the new king." Samuel knew it would not be an easy task. After all, Saul was still in power and the threat of change could be dangerous. But Samuel trusted in God's plan. Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, a small town where most people lived from agriculture and sheep herding. He met Jesse and asked him to bring out his sons. Imagine the scene, a powerful prophet who never left without a reason, asking to see the sons of a simple farmer. Jesse was confused but honored. One by one the sons were called and presented. First came Eliab, the eldest. He was tall, strong, and had a presence that inspired respect. Samuel looked at him and thought to himself, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." But then God spoke to Samuel's heart, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." How many times in our lives do we judge people by their appearance, by what they seem to be? But God, who sees everything, looks at the heart. He sees beyond appearances. One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel: Eliab, Abinadab, Shammah, and 4 other strong and imposing young men, but all of them were rejected by God. Samuel was perplexed. He knew that God never made mistakes. Then he turned to Jesse and asked, "Are these all your sons?" Jesse replied almost dismissively, "There is still the youngest David. He is tending the sheep." David was not even called for the presentation. He was just a shepherd, a simple boy who spent his days taking care of the flock. But Samuel insisted, "Send for him. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives." Imagine the surprise when David arrived. He entered still out of breath with the scent of the fields and sun-kissed skin, and his eyes shone with a special light. God, who does not make mistakes, spoke immediately to Samuel. "This is the one. Get up and anoint him, for he is the chosen one." Samuel took the holy oil, and right there, before David's brothers and his father, anointed the young shepherd as the next king of Israel. An unexpected and improbable scene. A simple boy, tending to sheep, being chosen to lead a nation. But God saw what no one else could see. David's heart, a humble, courageous heart, full of faith. This story teaches us a powerful and eternal lesson. For God, it is not strength, stature, or appearance that matters. What counts is what is inside the heart. David was not just a shepherd. He was a young man who spent hours in the fields alone caring for the sheep. During that time, he connected with God through songs and prayers. He not only fought against lions and bears to protect the flock, but also strengthened himself in faith and courage. Like David, perhaps you are also tending to your sheep, living a simple routine. But God sees something in you that no one else can see. Perhaps you are being prepared for something greater, for a special mission that is yet to come, and that is what matters, being ready, with your heart in the right place, for when God calls. The sun had barely risen and the tension in the air was already palpable. On one side stood the army of Israel, led by King Saul, positioned on the hills, nervous and apprehensive. On the other were the Philistines, ancient enemies of the Israelites, ready for battle. For 40 days a challenge echoed in the valley between the two armies, resonating like thunder. "Choose a man to fight me." This was the shout of Goliath, a giant, not only in size, but also in arrogance and intimidation. Over 3 meters tall, covered in shining and heavy armor, he seemed invincible. His spear was like a tree trunk, and his shield, carried by a squire, looked impenetrable. Every day, Goliath mocked the army of Israel, challenging them and insulting the God they served, but no one had the courage to face him. Meanwhile, in Bethlehem, there was a young shepherd named David. He was the youngest son of Jesse and was used to taking care of his family's sheep. But on that day, David had a different mission. His father had sent him to the Israelite camp to bring food to his older brothers, who were in the army. David arrived at the field curious, full of energy, and upon hearing Goliath's insults, something changed within him. While all the soldiers of Israel trembled in fear at the sound of the giant, David was indignant. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should challenge the army of the living God?" he asked the men around. The soldiers found it strange, a boy speaking so boldly, but he was not joking. For David, this was not just a physical battle, but a matter of faith. He knew that Goliath was not just challenging Israel, but insulting God, and that was something he could not accept. David's words soon reached the ears of King Saul, who, curious, summoned him. Imagine Saul's surprise when he saw a slender young man before him, offering to fight the giant who had terrified his best warriors. "You cannot fight against this Philistine," Saul said. "You are just a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth." But David was not intimidated. Confidently, he recounted how he had faced lions and bears while protecting his sheep, and how God had always given him victory. "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine," he declared. Saul, seeing David's unwavering faith, allowed him to go, though still with some hesitation. He even tried to dress David in his own armor, but it was too heavy for the young man, who preferred to wear his simple shepherd's clothes. David went to a nearby stream and chose 5 smooth stones, placing them in his shepherd's bag. He held a sling, a weapon he used to protect his flock, but that morning it would be used for a much greater purpose. As he walked toward the battlefield, he knew he was not going alone. He had something that Goliath did not possess, the presence and power of God by his side. When Goliath saw David approaching, he laughed in contempt. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" he mocked, trying to intimidate the young man. But David, with all the courage and faith he had, responded, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a shield. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." To all those present, it seemed an impossible fight. A young shepherd, unarmored, with only a sling, against a giant warrior clad in heavy armor. But David knew that it was not his strength that would matter at that moment. It was the strength of God. Then, the unthinkable happened. David placed a stone in his sling, swung it above his head, and launched it with precision. The stone flew through the air and struck Goliath right in the forehead. The giant staggered for a moment before falling face down to the ground, defeated. With a single blow, David had done what the entire army of Israel feared to attempt. He ran to Goliath, took the giant's sword, and cut off his head, showing the world that the power of God is greater than any human strength. The Philistines, who had once been so confident, were in shock at the sight of their champion fallen. The Israeli army was filled with courage and pursued the enemies, winning a great battle that day. David was not just a brave young man, he became a symbol of faith and hope for the people of Israel. He showed that, with God by our side, there is no giant too big, no obstacle impossible to overcome. Are you enjoying our video? I hope so. So don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on new content. David and Jonathan is one of the most beautiful demonstrations of friendship and loyalty that the Bible offers us. It all began unexpectedly at a time when David was starting to stand out in Israel. After defeating Goliath, he gained the admiration of the people and gradually won the trust of King Saul, who brought him to his palace. But it was in this setting that an unlikely and enduring bond emerged, the friendship between David and Jonathan, the son of the king himself. From the moment they met, something special happened between the two. Jonathan, who was a prince and heir to the throne, saw in David much more than a courageous young warrior. He perceived the pure heart, the courage, the humility, and above all the faith that David had in God. And David, in turn, found in Jonathan a true friend, someone he could count on and share his dreams and fears with. Jonathan was a man of noble character and a respected warrior. He did not feel threatened by David's growing popularity, even knowing that his father, King Saul, was beginning to see him as a rival. On the contrary, Jonathan admired David's qualities and saw the hand of God upon him. They formed such a strong bond that one day Jonathan made a pact with David. He promised to be faithful and support his friend regardless of the circumstances, and in a symbolic gesture, he gave David his own robe, his sword, bow, and belt, gifts that represented a deep respect and a true alliance. As time passed, the situation began to complicate. David was becoming more and more popular among the people of Israel. His victories in battles were celebrated and sung in the streets, and this sparked jealousy in Saul's heart. The king, who had previously welcomed David into his palace, began to fear that he would take his throne. Jealousy and fear led Saul to plot David's death on several occasions, but Jonathan, knowing his father's plans, could not stand idly by while his friendship with David was threatened. In a demonstration of courage and loyalty, he would warn David whenever Saul planned something against him. On one occasion, Jonathan said, "My father Saul wants to kill you. Hide until morning, and I will talk to him. I will try to convince him and let you know what he decides." Jonathan went to Saul and spoke of David with sincerity and courage. "Why do you want to harm David? He has done nothing against you. On the contrary, he risked his life to defeat Goliath and brought great victory to Israel. You yourself rejoiced at that on that day. So why kill an innocent man?" For a moment, Saul listened to the voice of reason and swore to Jonathan that he would not harm David. But the peace did not last long. On another occasion, during a banquet, Saul noticed that David was not present and, irritated, questioned Jonathan about his whereabouts. The prince, trying to protect his friend, made up an excuse, saying that David had gone to visit his family. But Saul did not believe it, and furious realized that Jonathan was helping David. He even insulted and threatened his own son, saying that while David was alive, Jonathan would never be king. This did not shake Jonathan. He knew that David was destined by God for great things, and that their friendship was worth more than any promise of power. That night, Jonathan went to meet David in the field where they had agreed. He carried a silent message for his friend. With his bow and arrows, he shot toward the field and shouted to the young man who was gathering the arrows, "The arrows are farther away." It was a signal for David to know that he needed to flee because his life was in danger. When the boy who collected the arrows left, David emerged from his hiding place and approached Jonathan. There they said goodbye, knowing that this could be the last time they saw each other. They embraced, cried, and reaffirmed the pact of friendship and loyalty that they had. Jonathan said, "Go in peace, for we have sworn loyalty before the Lord, saying that the Lord will be a witness between us and between our descendants forever." David fled, escaping Saul's attempts to remove him from the scene, but he never forgot Jonathan's words and the kindness of his friend. Jonathan risked everything, his position, his future, even his relationship with his father, to protect David. This friendship was an example of true love, placing the good of the other above any personal interest. Years later, when Jonathan lost his life in battle, David mourned deeply for the death of his friend. His pain was so great that he wrote a song in honor of Jonathan, remembering the loyalty and brotherly love they shared. And when David became king, he never forgot his promise. He sought out Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, to ensure that his friend's lineage continued to be protected and honored, demonstrating that the covenant they made was truly eternal. David had become a hero to the people of Israel. His victory over Goliath and his successive triumphs on the battlefield made him an admired and respected figure by all. People sang about his victories, and wherever he went, crowds cheered him. But while the people celebrated David, something dark was growing in the heart of King Saul: jealousy. Saul, who had initially welcomed David into his palace and even treated him as part of his family, began to fear losing the throne. He knew that God was no longer with him in the same way as before, and David's presence only heightened this feeling. Hearing the people sing, "Saul has slain thousands, but David tens of thousands," Saul could not hide his anger. With every praise for David, the bitterness in his heart grew, and he began to see the young man not as an ally, but as a threat. There was a moment when Saul, overwhelmed by jealousy and rage, tried to kill David impulsively. In a fit of fury, while David was playing the harp to calm him, Saul grabbed a spear and hurled it at the young man, attempting to pin him to the wall. David, agile, dodged the spear, but this was only the first of many attacks to come. Saul, feeling increasingly threatened by David's presence, began to plot his death, sending him on dangerous missions in hopes that he would not return alive. However, David was protected by God and always came back victorious, which only increased the king's anger. Realizing that the palace was no longer a safe place for him, David decided to flee. He left in secret, leaving behind the life he knew. His flight marked the beginning of years living as a fugitive, always one step ahead of Saul, who now devoted his efforts to hunting him down, determined to eliminate the one he considered his rival. David could no longer return home. He could not walk freely through Israel. He sought refuge in dark caves, hid in arid deserts, and counted only on the company of a few loyal men who decided to follow him. David wandered through the mountains of Judah, finding shelter in caves in places like Adullam and En-Gedi. These places were isolated, difficult to reach, and they became the perfect refuge for him and his men. But life as a fugitive was not easy. There were days when they had little food, cold nights when they slept on the stone ground, and moments of deep uncertainty. However, David never stopped trusting in God. Even amidst despair and persecution, he composed songs of praise and prayer, expressing his unwavering faith and the certainty that God was with him even in the darkest places. Saul, however, did not give up his pursuit. He mobilized his soldiers, sent out spies, and scoured the land in search of David. At one point, Saul received information that David was hiding in the caves of En-Gedi and immediately took 3,000 of his best soldiers to capture him. What happened next was one of the most powerful demonstrations of David's character. While Saul rested inside one of the caves, unaware that David and his men were hiding deep inside, David had a unique opportunity. His men encouraged him to take advantage of the moment to kill Saul, saying, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands.'" But David, instead of attacking, silently approached and cut off a piece of Saul's robe. He could have ended the pursuit then and there, could have taken revenge for all that Saul had done, but he chose not to harm the king. David knew that, despite everything, Saul was still the anointed of God, and that was something he respected deeply. When Saul left the cave, David called out to him from a distance. He showed the piece of Saul's robe and said, "My lord the king, why do you listen to those who say I want to harm you? Look at the piece of your robe in my hand. I could have killed you, but I did not, because I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed." Upon hearing these words, Saul was astonished. He saw the proof before his eyes and realized that David had had the chance to end his life, but chose to spare him. In a rare moment of clarity, Saul wept and said, "You are more righteous than I, for you have treated me well, while I have treated you badly." Despite this moment of apparent reconciliation, Saul did not change his intention. He still saw David as a threat to his throne. And the pursuit continued. David had to flee again, living as a nomad, always on alert, always seeking the next cave, the next shadow where he could hide. He sought refuge even among the enemies of Israel, such as the Philistines, in an attempt to escape Saul's relentless hatred. During these years of escape, David learned valuable lessons in leadership, patience, and total dependence on God. He could have claimed the throne by force and violence, but he preferred to wait for the right time, for the moment when God would give him the kingdom. His choice not to raise his hand against Saul showed not only his respect for the role of the king, but also his absolute trust in God's plan. He knew that vengeance and the seizure of power by force were not paths that would please God. Throughout all those years, David never stopped believing that one day this pursuit would end. And indeed, the moment came when Saul himself was defeated in battle, falling along with his sons on the battlefield. David was finally crowned king of Israel, not by usurpation or betrayal, but because he patiently waited for the moment when God would fulfill his promise. He showed everyone that true strength is not only in the ability to fight, but in the capacity to have faith, to wait, and to show mercy even to those who treated him as an enemy. The death of Saul and his son Jonathan marked the end of a turbulent era for Israel. The news of the tragedy reached David, who was taking refuge in the city of Ziklag, and his heart was filled with deep sorrow. David did not celebrate the fall of his former enemy. On the contrary, he mourned deeply not only for Saul but especially for Jonathan, his beloved friend. Amidst the tears, he composed a lament that echoed throughout the nation, praising the bravery of Saul and Jonathan, and lamenting the loss of a brotherly love that would never be forgotten. This moment of grief showed that David, even after being pursued by Saul for years, had a merciful and compassionate heart. With Saul dead, the throne of Israel was empty, and a new phase was beginning to unfold. The elders of Judah gathered and went to David, recognizing in him the leader that Israel needed. They anointed him king over the tribe of Judah, and thus David began to reign in Hebron, a city in the southern part of Israelite territory. However, this was only a part of the kingdom. The other tribes were still under the influence of Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who was proclaimed king by the commander Abner. This period marked the beginning of years of conflict, a civil war that divided the people of Israel into two sides, those who supported David and those who remained loyal to the house of Saul. Despite the battles that followed, David never lost sight of uniting the kingdom. He knew that the people needed peace and stability. During these years, he demonstrated not only his skill as a warrior, but also as a leader who knew how to wait for the right moment. He negotiated, offered truces, and maintained respect even for his adversaries, waiting for the time when God would unite all the people under a single reign. It was a period of many tensions and challenges, but also of patience and wisdom. Things began to change when Abner, the commander of Ishbosheth, decided to support David. He recognized that David was the one chosen by God to lead Israel and initiated talks to unite the tribes. However, before this alliance could be completed, Abner was assassinated by Joab, the commander of David's troops, in an act of personal vengeance. David was deeply upset by this incident, as he feared that the other tribes would see the event as a betrayal. He made a point to publicly mourn Abner's death, showing the people that he had not approved of such an act and reinforcing his desire for peaceful unity. The death of Saul and his son Jonathan marked the end of a turbulent era for Israel. The news of the tragedy reached David, who was taking refuge in the city of Ziklag, and his heart was filled with deep sorrow. David did not celebrate the fall of his former enemy. On the contrary, he mourned deeply not only for Saul but especially for Jonathan, his beloved friend. Amidst the tears, he composed a lament that echoed throughout the nation, praising the bravery of Saul and Jonathan and lamenting the loss of a brotherly love that would never be forgotten. This moment of grief showed that David, even after being pursued by Saul for years, had a merciful and compassionate heart. With Saul dead, the throne of Israel was empty, and a new phase was beginning to unfold. The elders of Judah gathered and went to David, recognizing in him the leader that Israel needed. They anointed him king over the tribe of Judah, and thus David began to reign in Hebron, a city in the southern part of Israelite territory. However, this was only a part of the kingdom. The other tribes were still under the influence of Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who was proclaimed king by the commander Abner. This period marked the beginning of years of conflict, a civil war that divided the people of Israel into two sides, those who supported David and those who remained loyal to the house of Saul. Despite the battles that followed, David never lost sight of uniting the kingdom. He knew that the people needed peace and stability. During these years, he demonstrated not only his skill as a warrior, but also as a leader who knew how to wait for the right moment. He negotiated, offered truces, and maintained respect even for his adversaries, waiting for the time when God would unite all the people under a single reign. It was a period of many tensions and challenges, but also of patience and wisdom. Things began to change when Abner, the commander of Ishbosheth, decided to support David. He recognized that David was the one chosen by God to lead Israel and initiated talks to unite the tribes. However, before this alliance could be completed, Abner was assassinated by Joab, the commander of David's troops, in an act of personal vengeance. David was deeply upset by this incident, as he feared that the other tribes would see the event as a betrayal. He made a point to publicly mourn Abner's death, showing the people that he had not approved of such an act and reinforcing his desire for peaceful unity. David desired not only to rule with power, but also to bring the heart of the people back to God. Bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem was an essential step in this process, symbolizing that the presence of God was at the center of the nation. The procession to bring the Ark was a grand event. David, wearing a simple linen garment, danced with all his joy through the streets, celebrating alongside the people of Israel. The arrival of the Ark in Jerusalem was a significant milestone, as it represented a spiritual victory much more than a simple military conquest. It was a reminder that, above all, the kingdom of Israel belonged to the Lord, and David, more than a king, was a servant who governed under God's guidance. With the Ark in the city, David continued to lead with zeal, building alliances and ensuring the safety and stability of the people. The kingdom prospered, and Israel enjoyed a peace it had not known in many years. David ruled with justice, always seeking divine guidance, and though he faced challenges and made mistakes, he always turned to God, acknowledging his flaws and seeking forgiveness. At the end of his life, David looked back and saw that his journey, marked by ups and downs, persecutions and victories, had been sustained by God's hand. He knew that his role was to prepare the way for something greater, the promise of an eternal kingdom that would come from his lineage. Although he would not be the one to build the temple, David left a spiritual legacy and a united kingdom that, under the rule of his son Solomon, would become one of the most prosperous in Israel's history. Thus, the story of David reminds us that even the most powerful leaders are above all servants of God, and that true greatness comes from a humble and faithful heart. His reign was proof that trust in God can transform a simple shepherd's life into a story of redemption, mercy, and eternal purpose. And it was with this heart, full of gratitude and reverence, that David ended his days, knowing that God had been his strength every step of the way.